Recent global acclaim of Korean cultural contents, including Netflix's Squid Game, has come with its fair share of criticism as well. And one such example is related to the task of translation. For more, I have Professor JASON BE-CHER-VAISE from Soongsil University. It's good to have you here, Professor.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Meanwhile, joining the session virtually is Professor Soh Jae-yong at the Seoul Institute of the Arts. Professor Soh, again, it's a pleasure to have you.
Nice to be here.
I also have BORIS DRAL-YUK at the Editor-in-Chief of the Los Angeles Review of the Books. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Mr. DRAL-YUK.
Thank you very much. An honor to be here.
Right, then we'll start here in the studio. Professor BE-CHER-VAISE, Parasite director Bong Joon-ho claimed that, well, he described subtitles as the one-inch barrier that needs to be overcome to truly indulge in many amazing productions. He said that. Now, fans of Squid Game appear to have done just that. What are your thoughts?
Oh, absolutely. They came out in a really big way. I think younger viewers in particular, they've got a real appetite for non-English language content. We're seeing that now in studies and surveys, seeing as much as like 80% of young people, so, teenagers and those in their 20s, watching subtitle content, which is much higher than some of the older demographics. And, someone like Bong Joon-ho, who grew up watching movies, he knows how much content there is out there, even before, the world of streaming, and, he'd watch stuff through his television, through the Forces Network here, the American Forces Network here in Korea. And now young people, they're kind of spoiled for choice. There's so much content available on Netflix, and Netflix saw, some time ago, the potential for non-English language content. Netflix is an American streaming service, but to ensure further growth, it needs to make sure that it lures in those subscribers from across the world. And so non-English language content is crucial for that. And they saw Korea as a major kind of hub for content, not only in Asia, but throughout much of the world. And in 2015, they kind of started financing and producing Korean language content. Bong Joon-ho's Okja, which is much of it's in English, of course, but it was a big gamble for them, and that caused a lot of controversy. And then we have Kingdom as well, and they formed collaborations between local production companies, and they've kind of laid seeds here in Korea. And I think Squid Game is reflective of this tremendous success that they've had in the Korean market.
Right. And staying with Squid Game, Professor Soh, Squid Game was offered in well over 30 different languages, either dubbed or subtitled. Do tell us a bit about the role of translation in Squid Game's global success.
Well, I mean, it's very obvious that this Korean content really initially meant for the Korean audiences, but it's gone way past that. As you mentioned, there's 31 languages that it was subtitled into, and then it was also dubbed. So they got actors, voice actors to come in and dub it into 13 different languages. So I think it made a huge significant role in making, something out of a country that's very small in the world, be able to distribute all over the world. And I think what's really interesting about it is that we've really started to concentrate on the quality of translation as well because of the popularity of this program. And, there's been a lot of backlash against Netflix's English subtitling. I think a few TikTok influencers were sort of bashing Netflix's, bad translation and things like that. So this has never happened before. And I think it's just the fact that this show is so popular. People are just really taking a look at every single aspect. But definitely the language, being able to translate across different countries has definitely been a factor in making this a global hit.
Right, and before we get into the criticism it faced, Mr. DRAL-YUK, the work of translators has been pivotal in international recognition of several Korean creative works. Now, I understand you are a renowned translator yourself. What would you say is the role of translation in cultural contents?
Well, I'll begin by stating the obvious. I don't think that any of the things that we've been talking about, Squid Game, or for that matter, award-winning novels like The Vegetarian, would be available outside Korea, even known outside Korea, were it not for translation. Really, these are household names now in the English-speaking world, and we have translators to thank for that. Now, of course, there are differences between subtitling films and television series and translating fiction and poetry, in which language is all we get. There are no moving images. That calls for great talent and skill, and deep familiarity with Korean language and culture, as well as crucially mastery of English. But luckily, over the past decade or so, we've seen the rise of truly brilliant translators from Korean working in every field. In literature, we have Don-Mi Choi, we have Deborah Smith and Anton Hoor. We even have a collective of Korean translators called Smoking Tigers who work together to bring Korean authors into English. And the success of their translations leads to more reader interest, reader demand, and publishers take notice. And suddenly publishing more Korean literature doesn't seem like a risk. It even seems like a sure bet. Also, the success of the television series, the success of Squid Games and of Parasite, the film, that creates more curiosity about Korean culture and Korean literature, which is a key into the culture.
Right. Mr. JASON, have you seen Squid Game?
You know what? I've avoided it because I'm very sensitive.
Understood, all right. Professor BE-CHER-VAISE, meanwhile, how do you respond to criticism of translations in Squid Game that Professor Soh just mentioned that reportedly hindered plot understanding and character development?
Well, personally, I watched Squid Game on its kind of the first weekend that it dropped on the service, and I didn't think the subtitles were that bad. I've been watching Korean content for 2 decades, and I've seen some really bad subtitles. And yeah, you know, they're not perfect, but I didn't think they were particularly poor. And I think we have to be careful here. I think, you know, constructive criticism is obviously a good thing, and that's important. But what we don't want is to scare off the subtitlers. And you know, they work very, very hard. It's a very difficult job. I've done some subtitling myself, not extensively, but I know how difficult it is. It's an art form. And Korean is a very difficult language to translate, you know, into English.
What's challenging for you in your translation work of Korean cultural content?
It's about trying to relay what's being said on screen in a very concise way. And sometimes the literal translation is the best way, but sometimes it's not. And you know, when there are cultural kind of connotations as well, it's very, very difficult. And while I do understand that, you know, the Squid Game translation was not perfect and certain things I would have translated differently, but I do think it's also important that we don't kind of scare the subtitlers off, and you know, I think it's a very difficult job to do, and also it's a series, it's not a film. You know, it's 6 episodes. You know, it's several episodes, and so that's a lot of work involved. And I'm not sure about their deadlines, and so yeah, it's not great, and certainly some work was needed to be done, and the subtitles were polished later on. But I do think it's also important that we do discuss the importance of subtitles. This is something that's, I think, relatively new. I think Parasite really was a game changer in that sense, you know, because a lot of people were discussing how good the subtitles were by my friend and colleague Darcy Parquet. And so I think, yeah, the discussion out there is a very, very good thing, but I do wonder whether, you know, being very overly critical on social media is the way we should go about it.
And Professor Soh, what are your thoughts with regard to translations in Squid Game?
Yeah, I agree with Jason. I think the subtitles, I looked at some of it. I did find some problematic things with the way it was subtitled, but at the same time, I think the press has really taken off on some of the social media. You know, sort of like basically their influence is really slamming on the show. And I heard that it's even sort of spread to French and Hindi subtitles for Squid Game. It wasn't really up to par. But I looked at it carefully myself, and I know there are very cultural nuances, you know, that are really difficult to translate into another language. For example, you know, I translated a major Korean film, and it was really hard to subtitle something very local. Like, for example, you know, we use Kakao Talk, which is our major sort of social network, you know, texting service, amongst others. But in other countries, you know, it's hard to translate that. So I had to like think, do I want to use WhatsApp, or is there another text service that other countries would like? So these are kind of like really hard cultural, I would say, small detailed stuff in each culture that every culture has in their language that's really hard to do. And as it was pointed out today, that, you know, basically subtitling is really difficult. Even the best subtitlers have a very hard time doing it. Also, you're under a time crunch. Remember, it's not like you have all the time in the world to finish this job. You have a deadline that's coming up, and so I think Squid Game was again really analyzed because it was such a big hit. But yeah, I looked at it. Yes, there's some problematic parts of it, but overall, it's not as bad as they claim.
Right. And Mr. Dral-Yuk, some pundits like Professor BE-CHER-VAISE point out that translation itself is a form of art that is often very little appreciated. Having said that, what do you believe is important in the work of translation? Word for word direct translations or the ability to make appropriate adaptations?
It's an excellent question. And I just want, before I answer that question, to say that I completely agree about the role of subtitlers, and we should really go easy on people who devote so much time and energy to figuring out how to pack all of that cultural information into a very small space. But now I'll answer your question. The more I translate, the more I realize that simply accurate, competent translations are very useful for academic purposes, but they probably won't win the author the audience she deserves, because translation really is an art first and foremost. And when you're translating especially a poem or a short story, you're writing a poem or a short story in the target language. The translation has to stand on its own as a work of art, or it won't convince readers that the original is a work of art. So you have to understand profoundly the meaning and style of the original, all of those nuances, but then you have to use that understanding in order to make something as powerful as the original in the target language.
Right, which is really challenging. It's easier said than done, isn't it?
It takes a lot of bravery too, because of course, departing from the original in order to create something as powerful as the original takes guts.
It really does, right? Meanwhile, Professor BE-CHER-VAISE, Disney Plus subscribers here in Korea have been complaining about the quality of subtitles offered by the streaming services. What do you suppose is to blame for this unfortunate reality?
Well, yeah, I think it's in terms of some of their content, Toy Story 3 and The Simpsons, it's been translated very, very poorly. It almost seems like it's been done through a computer or something. I'm not sure exactly what's happened. I guess I want to think it's teething problems. So hopefully, over time, that they will be improved. Obviously, there's a lot of content suddenly being launched in Korea at the same time. The good thing about subtitles on streaming platforms is they can improve them. So it's not like a film like Parasite and it's out in theaters or it's screening at festivals and then available on Blu-ray. The subtitles there are fixed, whereas on streaming sites they can actually improve the subtitles, and I imagine that's what they're going to do because it has caused quite a backlash.
You're right, it has. Professor, so what are your prospects with regard to the role of translation in the cultural contents industry as a whole?
Well, I think everybody's pointed out today that it's becoming more of a major role in any kind of content, whether it's audio visual or actually things like novels or short stories or books. And I think there was a mention, Jason and I talked about how it's done automatically. So, there are processes in work right now where they're trying to use AI technology to improve on it. I know Google Translate, or in Korea we have Papago. Those translation sites actually are used a lot, but it's very limiting. So, I've actually tried using that to sort of fast track my translation process, and I had to give up because it was so bad. But I think AI is definitely something different from an automated system, because what it does is actually it learns the nuances of a language, and it'll actually take on the characteristics of a human. So I think what we need to do, the reason why a lot of translation has problems also is because we not only have a very small pool of translators, but the pay is very low for a translator as well. So I think that's another problem, that to get really excellent translators, it's really hard for them to make a living out of just translating. So we need to really start to invest in translation, and a lot of these companies like Neflix, because of the backlash, I heard that the translator for Bong Joon-ho actually came in to revise the translation for Squid Game. Sharon Choi, she translated for Bong Joon-ho. So So I mean, they're trying to make an effort, but I think right now the shortage of translators is a major problem. The industry really has to sort of put a lot of money into sort of developing and training translators to be able to make more content. And this only applies not only to Korea, but any country that wants to go global on their content.
Of course. Mr. Dral-YUK, what are your thoughts on the current capacity over in the US to translate Korean language works into English?
Well, I'm not really an expert in the audiovisual realm, so I can't speak to what I think the other panelists have said so, I think, clearly, that there needs to be more support and more recognition for the translators as well as more pay. I can speak a little bit about Korean literature, and I think it's a boom time for Korean literature in English. I mentioned a few translators earlier, but there are also presses that specialize in literature from Asia that publish quite a lot of Korean literature, Tilted Access, Hanford Star. There's Journal Korean Literature Now, which brings a lot of new names into English. And you know, what we get is a picture of a vibrant literary culture with writers exploring questions of social inequality, vibrant questions of queerness, maybe women's role, and just plain old existence. And in a remarkable range of styles, tones, genres, and that's very exciting. It's an exciting development, and I hope that both publishers and funding agencies continue to support it.
Right. Mr. Dral-YUK, you mentioned Han Gang's The Vegetarian earlier on, the book itself, which won the Man Booker International Prize over in the UK. Have you read that book then?
Yes.
And what were your thoughts on that?
Well, I thought it was a brilliant translation stylistically, and I think that Deborah Smith has gone on not only to translate other works just as impressively, and of course I can't assess the accuracy of the translation fully, but I can definitely assess the stylistic accomplishment of it. The book would not have done as well as it did were it not for Smith's command of style.
Right, good to know. Professor BE-CHER-VAISE, what needs to be done then now to perhaps perfect the work of translations of audiovisual Korean productions?
Well, I think we touched on this already, but certainly I think translators need to be paid properly and ensure that they have they're given enough time to properly translate. Because I think there's a tendency, in Korea to do things very, very quickly, and the deadlines are sometimes not fair. And I think it's great that we're talking about it. The fact that we're on this show discussing the translations of these shows and programs and books as well, I think is testament to the fact that it's being discussed openly, and I think this is a positive development. But I think if we're going to improve the conditions for translators, I think there needs to be active discussions about how we can do that. So yeah, improving the conditions, the pay, perhaps not having just one translator, but perhaps having more than one. Not saying huge numbers, but certainly I think if there's a team of translators on any given production, then perhaps certainly like a show where there are several episodes, that certainly might help things. Whereas if you just got one translator, that's a lot of responsibility.
Right. And Professor Soh, talking about, you mentioned investments earlier on. What investments then do you propose to better align the quality of translations to perhaps the soaring global interest in Korean contents?
Well, I think, Mr. JAe-yuk talked about it already. I think there needs to be more people willing to translate. We just have a shortage of manpower that, knows both languages. So I think he mentioned vegetarian, but again, like the people that translate have to have that sort of command of the language, understanding. And right now, I heard that something like to get a really good translation, you need to get 90% of it right in the other language. And then it's the 10% that makes it a great translation or just a normal translation. And that 10% is very expensive, is what I heard from a translator. So I think we need to really kind of invest more and also train people more in this area.
Right. And Mr. Dral-YUK, what would you say is the next challenge that needs to be tackled by Korean content producers, that is, with regard to the task of translation?
I do think that funding is crucial. I think recognition is the first step to funding. I think the more we know about the translators, the more the recognition the translators get, the easier it is for them to ask for more money, the easier it is for them to ask for the conditions that enable their work. I also agree that education is crucial. When people are stretched very thin, they don't have the time to acquaint themselves with the text properly. They don't have the time to steep themselves in the context of the text, the scene that the text is describing. What you're going to get is that 90% translation rather than the 100% translation.
Right, I see. All right, Mr. JAL-YUK, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. Professor Soh, thank you very much for your insights. And Professor BE-CHER-VAISE here in the studio, thank you for your time.
Thank you.